Run.
Hello and welcome to another episode where we discuss social media listening tools, especially in the context of supply chain. But we are not just discussing social media, we're discussing listening tools. With me is my friend Raamesh. Both of us are co presenting it, co hosting it, talking to each other. Um, so, we want to discuss in this episode um, electronic version of conventional media. At one point of time, newspapers used to be almost a major source of information. They are a big source of information, but right now, there's 24/7 cable TV. There is things on internet all the time. There is social media. There is more false news on social media than on television. Not to say that there's not enough false and fake news on TV also, but so we'll discuss how scraping information from newspapers can be relevant in terms of their electronic format. Ramesh, what is the relevance of newspapers in this world? Shouldn't they be dead already?
Perhaps, but the thing about a newspaper is at least an old-fashioned newspaper like the Washington Post or the New York Times is that they have journalists who still have some sense of integrity. They have journalists who are trained to analyze the news, who can sift
Hmm.
falsehoods from, they're not in the breaking news culture. So therefore, you get more decent analysis, you get verified news. So I think that is certainly something worth retaining in our society and certainly something worth listening to.
Yeah,
And for listening tools to be able to pull out credible sources, I think the ability to scrape newspaper articles is very important.
that thanks. So, what do you think about the comments in a newspaper? Because nowadays there are a lot of comments in a newspaper by the readers, and they
Yes,
sometimes turn into their own personal wars, right? People throwing mud at each other without really listening to each other.
yes, they turn into what we call flame wars. But they're very interesting because they also allow for a whole lot of opinion to be shared. Sometimes these are opinions that are not otherwise publishable opinions. So you
Hmm.
do get to know the reactions of a whole lot of people, and sometimes they carry nuggets of information that may otherwise be missed. So a manual reader might miss these nuggets, which
Hmm.
an electronic scraper would not. You know.
Hmm.
So, for example, if there is news about a shortage of vaccine or something, say about the crisis in Flint, Michigan, for example, and it is in the comments that you would probably see people talking about other places which may otherwise go unreported. Shortages of vaccines or or even of toilet paper or certain other goods. So the comment section is often a place for what you would call undiscovered treasures.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, in addition to comments, when one is analyzing news, do you think analyzing news um, on websites such as New York Times, Washington Post, HuffPo, is it the same as analyzing things on Facebook or Twitter, or is it any different?
For one, they're declaredly open source. So all the news that is there on New York Times. Now, of course, some of them have gone behind a paywall, but the notion is they're supposed to be openly accessible, and these are not somebody's private information, right? And therefore,
Mhm.
this is public information, uh, almost you could say intended to be searchable, and therefore the information there has higher credibility compared to somebody's ravings and rantings on Facebook may not carry enough information value per se. Apart
I
from
would
the
like,
yeah,
go ahead.
apart from the privacy issues, that was all I was
Yeah.
saying.
I was saying I believe my ravings and rantings on Facebook carry more weight than articles in New York Times or Washington Post, but that's just my personal opinion. If you believe in it, that'll make total of two people in the world to believe in this. But yeah, coming to
But that's a
Ah,
point here. So one of the things about what we call fake news is that its believability increases when somebody you trust posts that, right? So therefore, you posting an article with or without verification compared to an article on the New York Times is for your circle of friends at least carries more credibility. So in that sense,
mhm.
at least a social media post has more credibility, which a listening tool needs to kind of take into account.
Absolutely. So now, in addition to that, the news articles tend to be longer.
Yeah.
So one can look into a few things, as would be obvious to our listeners, that investigative journalism is on the decline. So often what happens is the news is reported in parallel. So it could be Associated Press or Reuters sending out some information, and that information really gets just put out in various news sources. Uh, but there is still some amount of investigation, investigative journalism still there. And secondly, Associated Press, Reuters, these kind of agencies are not really looking for local news. So in local newspapers, you can get information which could be very relevant for policy making uh, in terms of big data, in terms of finding patterns, especially for supply chain, what really we are passionate about, finding out local issues, right? So now
Completely.
coming to the issue of, let's say, information being picked up from AP or Reuters versus investigative journalism, what you might have is information in parallel. So all the newspapers are showing you exactly the same thing with slight change in language. Or alternatively, you can have newspapers build a story. Now, a same article can have multiple components. So you can look at, stance analysis, sentiment analysis, those kind of things. But and semantic analysis, these are sort of the three pillars. But what you would essentially be looking for is how much in-depth the article is, what is the tone, how much are the facts correct or not. We are not trying to bore you with any technical details, but a single newspaper article could have multiple topics. Social media rants tend to usually be on one topic. They can obviously vary, but we are talking general trend. Especially on Twitter, they tend to be very narrow because of the character limit. So it's a interesting format. Now, what happens is, I'll give you an example. When we did work on analysis of HIV news, we found most of it peaked right around HIV Day, which happens to be early in December. And otherwise, it was flat thing. And then we looked at the categories. What we found interestingly is things about dating were more common rather than shortage of medicine, cost of medicine. Things about taboo, how to deal with family, they were still more relevant. Now, news happens to have a clickbait character because viewership is on the decline. So they tend to publish articles which will catch people's attention rather than detailed policy related stuff all the time. Some bigger newspapers still carry decent amount of information which is useful for policy. So categorization, classification of news is very, very relevant. And then on top of all of that, we also found interestingly that regions which had higher incidence of HIV and AIDS actually were carrying less of news versus places where awareness was higher were carrying higher news. So in some ways, it can tell policymakers where to put what. Now, similarly, the same can be applied to supply chain. So, doing geospatial analysis of news coverage from local news or even local versions of the same news. So, for example, if you're even just listening, reading BBC, and you're opening the same website from different countries, you'll look at your location and open things accordingly. Most newspapers have a local city section. So, um, understanding that geospatial perspective of what information people in one region are having access to. Now, it's not entirely true if they want to be on Facebook and Twitter, which majority of the population is, they can still reach out, but at least when they're reaching to their first newspaper, the first impressions will be tailorized for their region, right? So what information they're getting. So it is relevant from two perspectives on supply chain. One is to find out what shortages are there, what is in excess, what is in demand, but also even for government to put awareness of certain things. Let's say some people are panicking about not enough meat supply or not enough toilet paper in one place or shortage of medicine, and the government has enough stock. Let's say the federal government has enough stock, so the administration, White House, could actually issue instructions, and accordingly they can be press releases, they can be actually information spread, there can be programs for particular regions where there is being some panic buying, where there are being false rumors. So understanding newspapers, this analytics, listening to newspapers can do a lot. um, I would like to come back to Ramesh on the question of when you have multiple newspapers and you're listening about the same region, same issue, right? What problems can arise, and what is the benefit of listening to multiple newspapers rather than relying on one or two?
So the thing about multiple newspapers is this. See, different newspapers have different priorities. So for a New York Times, which although has nationwide coverage, for it to give weightage to local events, it is a judgmental call between the editor and the reporters, etc. And they may miss out a lot of very hyper local events. Whereas something like a Sacramento reporter or a Milwaukee Gazette or some or most of these smaller town newspapers, right? They will pick up a lot more local news. So if there is a run on a bank, or if there is a rush for say toilet paper, or if there is a shortage of vaccines or something, or there are local, really local issues which are nevertheless newsworthy, then these get covered in the smaller newspapers, and which therefore your listening engine should probably give a little more weightage to those, because from a supply chain point of view, these are a lot more relevant. For
Mm-hmm.
a nationwide newspaper, even if it has city editions, the kind of things that they will choose to cover depends on editorial judgment, and often hyper-local news gets completely overlooked. So,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of supply chain, I think these local newspapers give you a lot more information compared to the larger newspapers. Yes, if you're analyzing national trends, if you want
Mm-hmm.
in-depth articles by experts and all, by all means refer to a national newspaper website. But I think it is far more useful in terms of whatever you're trying to do in terms of supply chain, in terms of local government, in terms of local ecology, or whatever that is hyper local. Then these smaller newspapers should carry a lot more weight.
Mm-hmm. That sounds very useful, and the emphasis to have on local newspapers. And similarly, there are news websites which are not for newspapers, but these are websites essentially of TV channels. So you will have news from, let's say, various state level cable
Yes,
news, and they carry information. Now, one thing that has happened um, is that there are few houses which control all the states in the US and in Canada. Real independent television or real independent newspapers are on a decline. They're not extinct, but they're on a decline, which also results in certain issues, that there is more homogenization of news. There's more of the same agenda, which gets dominated by different political parties. I mean, more of the conservative versus liberal factions, both in US and Canada. There'll be biases based on the channels, based on the newspapers, and everything gets colored in some ways. So, and there are PR experts telling people at every local place what will get more traction versus not.
correct.
So sometimes those interests override genuine reporting. So those are the problems of the world we live in. Uh, as a response to it in US, A lot of radio is popular, but that tends to be, I mean, both on the left and on the right. Again, tends to be very political, but at times even these very popular radio hosts uh, tend to have on their website news, right? So non-social media news, essentially in form of newspaper, in form of websites of these TV channels, or in terms of websites of even the talk show hosts on radio, which carry small snippets, they can give a lot of information. Now, Ramesh, how, I mean, we have distinguished, I would say this first category gets fuzzy around radio hosts and all because the verification gets lower and lower, right? The more you get towards the radio host, it gets more towards the opinions, agendas, sometimes very needed information, but agendas compared to tier one newspaper. I'm not trying to say tier one newspapers are neutral. It's like saying scientific editorial process, peer review process is neutral. There are large lobbies, big names carry weight. Um, there is agenda, obviously, but there is a certain level of quality and there's at least pretension of fairness. We are not saying big news is fair. Nobody is trying to defend media here at all. But, and we are also not trying to throw it in the ditch because we can't work without it.
Right. So
Media is obviously, yeah, go ahead, Ramesh.
from an entirely listening point of view and from an entirely supply chain point of view, I think these ideological leanings are often they are clearly a hindrance because very often, for example, something may be suppressed if it feels the ruling establishment may be embarrassed, or if it may lead to an embarrassment for you ideologically, to say that way, which may therefore lead to harming the public good.
Mhm.
But nevertheless, very often, I think if you political opinion tends often to be on a more federal or countrywide scale as opposed to because you want your opinion to be heard by those who share your opinion, and that is a lot less than say for example water supply to your neighborhood being disrupted, because then that is local apolitical news. It doesn't matter which way you swing. It is a distinct the problem that needs a solution, and that is often a municipal issue. So these are things that local newspapers or local radio channels or even local cable TV covered much better. And
Hmm.
we have to figure, see, social listening tools also need to be able to discount out the political content of any news. I think most news is semantically or as you would say ideologically tilted this way or the other, even when it is supposedly completely objective news. But
Yeah,
so building in those filters will nevertheless be able to give you more focused listening tool. And given that our focus is on supply chain, I think being able to filter out ideology is an important component of this process.
absolutely. And I think analyzing the same news being reported by two extremes of political ideology, more moderate wings, right?
Yep.
Which tend to even overlap will be useful because then you know what things get reported bit out of context, right? What is the added agenda to everything? How um, people tend to use one thing as a vehicle for another thing. I mean, I'll give you an example. If you don't like a particular administration, you may report shortage and you then spend half the time in an article, even in a major newspaper, discussing policies of that administration, right? So, how to extract information from an article, from whether our agenda, in this case, we are extremely interested in supply chain, whatever your agenda is, right? So how to filter that out? Now, there's another issue that arises out of listening to multiple news sources, and that essentially is, do you overcount incidences? So there's a famous case of Google Flu Trends, which failed. Apparently, it was reporting incidences 3 times more than CDC was. So it did not disambiguate the number of cases being reported in multiple places accurately. right? So the same case is being reported in various places. It's multiple social media platforms are discussing that. There are various news reports. So it's screwed up in various ways, not the only way, but it's screwed up in basic maths. In basic mathematics, it ended up screwing up because you could not distinguish that the two news are of the same thing.
So one
And
of
that
the critical, what you would call data flaws of scraping news sites is the fact that most news sites, actually all news sites, have First Amendment protections and they need not reveal their source. Okay, now for data tracking, as an academic, you will know that citing your sources is very important. But because newspapers have First Amendment protections, they needn't cite their sources, which means it is now very difficult to figure out whether which source a newspaper is citing, and that is exactly the problem of overcounting. So, different
yeah,
newspapers reporting the same thing, are they reporting from the same source? Are they reporting different sources? And therefore, you get wild counts. You know, if there has been, say, a natural disaster, there from one website to another, there are very
hmm,
wide counts of how many people are affected. Some may say it is in the millions, some may say it's in the hundreds, and
hmm,
therefore, yes, that does become an issue with this thing. But
yeah,
then again, if they did not have those First Amendment protections, the news business itself would become impossible.
yeah. So you bring up an important issue also of the source, which is very relevant to this discussion. Uh, so I think we had a very long discussion today on scraping from non-typical social media from actually news websites. I think for this episode, we should say bye to our viewers, to our listeners, and come back next time with discussing few other media platforms.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, wonderful, Ramesh. Goodbye
Thanks,
for now.
Sukant. Bye.